Every war in the last 100 years made the same 20 companies richer. You didn't notice because you were told to focus on who won. The real question is who sold to both sides. The answer has not changed since 1914. This is not ancient history. This is the operating system running beneath your newsfeed right now. The names rotate slightly. The pattern never does. By the end of this video, you will see the mechanism so clearly that you will never watch a conflict the same way again. You will understand the stages. You will recognize your position inside them. And you will know exactly what they need you to ignore. Right now, someone is profiting from a war you barely remember started. The weapons didn't appear out of nowhere. The vehicles didn't materialize. The fuel didn't pump itself. Every bullet has a purchase order. Every missile has a manufacturer. Every conflict has a supplier class that operates in the space between flags. You don't see them because they don't wear uniforms. They wear earnings reports. And those reports spike in a pattern so consistent that you can set your calendar by it. The moment a regional tension becomes a headline, a specific category of stock begins to move. The moment diplomacy is declared dead, those same stocks accelerate. And the moment a ceasefire is announced, they begin positioning for the next cycle. This is not opportunism. This is design. The trap begins long before the first shot. It begins when a government is convinced it needs to be ready for a conflict that does not exist yet. That is stage one. The hypothetical threat, the distant enemy, the abstract weakness that must be corrected immediately. Fear is sold in bulk to budget committees. 2. And the companies with the most advanced lobbying infrastructure are there to write the solution into the spending bill before the public even hears the threat. Stage 1 is invisible to you because it happens in conference rooms, where the outcome is determined before the vote. The product is not a weapon, the product is a dependency. Once a nation is locked into a specific weapons platform, a specific logistics provider, a specific maintenance contract, switching becomes unthinkable. The cost of transition becomes the cost of failure, and failure is a word no defense minister can afford. Stage 2 is the contract structure. These are not one-time purchases. They are multi-decade platforms with guaranteed upgrades, guaranteed parts replacement, and penalties for early termination. The initial bid is always competitive. The long-term lock-in is always devastating. A fighter jet purchased in 2005 requires parts from the same manufacturer until 2045. A missile defense system sold in 2010 requires software updates that only one company can provide. The contract is designed to make the first purchase feel prudent and the 10th purchase feel inevitable. You are not buying a product. You are buying a relationship that extracts budget every year until the platform is obsolete. And by the time it is obsolete, the replacement is already being lobbied into the next decade's budget. Then comes stage 3. The conflict materializes. It does not matter if the war was predictable or chaotic. It does not matter if it began with an invasion or an incident. What matters is that the systems purchased in stage 1 and locked in during stage 2 are now being deployed at scale. Inventory moves, contracts accelerate. Emergency appropriations are passed with bipartisan speed. The public is told this is about defense. The earnings calls tell a different story. Revenue spikes, backlog grows, guidance is erased. Stock prices move in lockstep with casualty reports. This is not correlation. This is the business model paying out exactly as designed. Let me take you backward. In 1914, the arms manufacturers of Europe had spent a decade selling escalation to every major power. Krupp in Germany, Vickers in Britain, Schneider in France. They did not start the war. They made the war inevitable by ensuring that every nation had the capacity and the doctrine to fight it. The weapons existed before the war justified the weapons retroactively. When the guns began firing, those companies did not just fulfill orders. They expanded capacity, they opened new plants, they hired new workers, and they made profits that would be unimaginable in peacetime. Friedrich Krupp died in 1902, but his company became the largest private arms manufacturer in the world by 1916. The firm survived the war. It survived the treaty. It rebuilt under a new flag. Because the product is not loyalty to a nation. The product is capacity for conflict. And capacity does not care which side wins. Move forward to 1937. The Spanish Civil War became a testing ground. German firms sent planes. Soviet firms sent tanks. American firms sent trucks and radios and fuel. It was called intervention. It was called aid. But the suppliers were paid in gold and contracts. The ideological war was a product demo for the next one. By the time World War II began, the infrastructure was already in place. The relationships were established. The margins were understood. When the United States entered the war in 1941, the manufacturing base did not need to be created. It needed to be activated. And the companies that had quietly supplied both sides of earlier conflicts were now the sole providers to the Allied powers. General Motors, Ford, DuPont, they did not just supply the war effort, they architected it. And when the war ended, they owned the patents, the facilities, and the government contacts that would define the next 50 years of defense contracting. The Korean War arrived in 1950. The weapons platforms from World War II were obsolete. New jets, new doctrines, new enemies, but the supplier class remained unchanged. Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop. The names were American now, but the pattern was identical. Build the platform in peacetime. Lock in the contracts. Wait for the conflict. When the shooting started, the stock price followed. Lockheed's revenue doubled between 1950 and 1953. Boeing's military contracts became the majority of its business. This was not patriotism. This was margin expansion disguised as national security. And it worked because the public was told to focus on the enemy, not the invoice. Vietnam extended the model. The war lasted 20 years. The weapons contracts lasted 30. Helicopters that were cutting edge in 1965 were still being purchased in 1985 because the replacement programs were delayed, defunded, or redesigned to require the same suppliers. The Bell UH-1, the Boeing CH-47. These were not just tools of war, they were annuities. Every flight hour required parts. Every part required a contract. Every contract renewed the dependency. The war ended in 1975. The supplier relationships did not. They transitioned into the Cold War budget. The enemy changed. The spreadsheet did not. Stage 4 is where the system becomes self-sustaining. You no longer need a hot war to justify the spending. You need the idea of war. You need the possibility of conflict. You need the adversary to exist in speeches and threat assessments and intelligence briefings. The Cold War perfected this. The Soviet Union was real. The threat was real. But the scale of spending was not proportional to the threat. It was proportional to the lobbying power of the firms that had spent 40 years embedding themselves in the budget process. By 1985, the United States was spending more on defense than the next 10 nations combined. Not because the threat required it, because the system required it. The contracts were evergreen. The platforms were generational. And the firms that built them had become the only firms capable of building them. Competition was dead. Dependency was total. This brings us to the present cycle. The Cold War ended in 1991. The defense budget should have collapsed. It did not. It paused. Then it found new enemies. The Gulf War in 1991. The interventions in the Balkans. The war on terror after 2001. Each conflict reset the cycle. Each reset extended the contracts. And each extension raised the baseline. A Tomahawk missile cost $800,000 in 1991. By 2020, the same missile cost $2 million. Not because the technology improved, because the supplier had no competition and the buyer had no alternative. Raytheon builds the missile. Raytheon maintains the missile. Raytheon trains the personnel. Raytheon writes the software updates. You are not buying a weapon, you are buying a monopoly with a guidance system. Stage 5 is the feedback loop. The more you spend, the more you depend. The more you depend, the less you can afford to stop. Lockheed Martin's F-35 program is the clearest example. The project began in 2001. The first operational jets were delivered in 2015. The program is now expected to cost $1.7 trillion over its lifetime. Not $1.7 trillion for the jets, $1.7 trillion for the jets, the parts, the maintenance, the training, and the software updates required to keep them flying until 2070. The contract is 50 years long. Lockheed will service planes for children who are not born yet. This is not a sale, This is a subscription model applied to warfare, and it works because no government can admit the program is too expensive to continue. Cancelling the F-35 would mean admitting that $1 trillion was wasted, so the spending continues. The delays are tolerated, the cost overruns are absorbed, and Lockheed's stock price tracks the inevitability. Every modern conflict follows the same supply map. Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, Gaza. The weapons arrive from the same manufacturers. The logistics flow through the same contractors. The financing is structured through the same export credit agencies. The United States provides the hardware, the suppliers provide the invoice, and the conflict zones provide the justification for the next budget cycle. When a Javelin missile is fired in Ukraine, Raytheon does not lose inventory, it gains a backlog. The missile costs $200,000. The replacement contract is already signed. The war does not interrupt the business model. The war is the business model expressing itself at full capacity. This is where the promise turns into a leash. You are told the spending is for your safety. You are told the weapons are for deterrence. But deterrence is just another word for perpetual readiness, and perpetual readiness requires perpetual spending. The defense budget is not designed to shrink. It is designed to grow at a rate slightly faster than inflation. Every year, forever. Even in peacetime, the budget rises. Because the contracts are locked, the platforms are generational, and the firms that supply them have optimized for one outcome. They do not want peace. They want manageable conflict. They do not want victory. They want long wars with clear enemies and bipartisan support. Because long wars mean long contracts. And long contracts mean guaranteed returns. Stage 6 is normalization. You stop seeing it as unusual. $1 trillion defense budget becomes the baseline. A 20-year war becomes standard policy. Cost overruns of 30% become an acceptable margin of error. The public is trained to expect this. The language shifts. It is no longer called waste. It is called investment. It is no longer called profiteering. It is called strategic partnership. The firm that makes the missile also funds the think tank that publishes the report that justifies the missile. The general who approves the contract retires into a board seat at the contractor. The lobbyist who wrote the legislation becomes the assistant secretary who administers it. This is not corruption in the legal sense. This is the system operating as designed. The revolving door is not a bug. It is load-bearing infrastructure. Let me show you the math in plain terms. Lockheed Martin's revenue in 2023 was $67 billion. 60% of that came from the US government. Raytheon's revenue was $68 billion. 70% from government contracts. Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Boeing's Defense division. The top 5 contractors take in more than $200 billion a year from public funds. That money is not discretionary. It is locked into multi-year programs that cannot be cancelled without triggering penalty clauses and political fallout. These firms do not compete for your business. They compete for position in a budget that is guaranteed to grow. Their customer is a monopoly. Their product has no substitute. And their revenue is protected by the fact that no elected official can afford to be seen as weak on defense. Here is what this means for you. Every dollar spent on a weapon system that sits in a warehouse is a dollar not spent on infrastructure you use. Every cost overrun on a fighter jet program is a cost absorbed by a budget that could have funded something else. You are told this is the price of security. But security is not the product being sold. The product is the contract, and the contract is designed to renew itself regardless of the threat environment. The war in Afghanistan ended in 2021. The defense budget did not drop, it redirected. The enemy changed from terrorism to great power competition. The suppliers remained identical. The spending continued. Because the system is not reactive. It is automated. You are here. Right now, in stage 6, you have been trained to see conflict as inevitable. You've been trained to see spending as necessary. You've been trained to ignore the fact that the same firms profit regardless of the outcome. When a ceasefire is signed, you are told to celebrate peace. The contractors celebrate backlog. When a new threat emerges, you are told to prepare. The contractors were already prepared. They wrote the threat assessment. They built the response. And they will sell it to you as if they just invented it. The survival payoff is simple. Stop treating defense spending as untouchable. Recognize that every platform has an alternative. Every contract has a competitor. And every conflict has a supplier class that benefits from prolonging it. When you hear the phrase national security, ask who wrote the memo. When you hear about a new weapons program, check who holds the contract. When you see a stock price spike during a crisis, follow the ticker back to the boardroom. You do not need to oppose defense, you need to oppose monopoly. And monopoly is what you have when 5 companies control 70% of the budget and write the legislation that funds them. Second rule, demand transparency on cost. A weapons program that runs 50% over budget is not a failed program. It is a successful extraction. The cost overrun is the profit. The delay is the extension. And the complexity is the moat. If a contractor cannot deliver on time and on budget, they should lose the contract. But they do not. But because the system is designed to reward scale, not performance, break that assumption. Support legislators who tie contracts to delivery. Support procurement reform that penalizes failure. The firms will say this threatens national security. What it threatens is their margin. Third rule, understand that the conflict you see on the news is not the conflict that matters to the supplier. They do not care who wins. They care that both sides keep firing. A peace dividend is a revenue loss. A ceasefire is a backlog delay. The incentive structure is inverted. The firms that build the tools of war have no financial interest in ending war. They have an interest in making war sustainable, permanent, and politically untouchable. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, you stop funding it with your silence. The pattern will repeat. A new adversary will be identified. A new threat will be sold. A new platform will be proposed. The budget will expand, the contracts will lock, and the same names will appear in the earnings reports. Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, Boeing, General Dynamics. They have been there since Korea. They will be there for the next war, not because they are the best, because they are the only. And they are the only because every alternative was acquired, outlobbied, or starved of contracts until it collapsed. This is not a conspiracy. This is a business model. And it runs on your inability to see it. If this opened your eyes to the cage you are living in, subscribe. Because in the next video, we dismantle the rest of the illusion.